Great. Well, thank you very much, Mr. Levchenko, for introducing me. Thank you all for being here for this discussion. I hope that you already had a successful series of talks leading up to now, and you will continue to do so. My name is Andres Sevtsuk. I am an associate professor of urban science and planning in the Department of Urban Studies and Planning. And I also lead the city design and development group within our department. This is the part of our department that deals with the physical transformation and physical aspects of our cities that connect to all sorts of other topics, including economic development and real estate and so forth. I'm also connecting to you today, actually not from Boston because I'm traveling right now, but from Estonia. And being here, I'm originally Estonian. I send you very warm greetings, and so many people around me are really in thoughts with all of you back in Ukraine, and are very supportive and understand the difficulties of your situation. Let me try to get my screen up and running, and can you please let me know if you can see my screen?
Yes, we can.
Yep. Great. I'm going to hide some of these controls. Okay. So the topic that I will be talking about today has to do with the economic development of small businesses on city streets, what I call street commerce. Street commerce involves retailers, restaurants, cultural amenities, service providers, recreational businesses, all sorts of small businesses that people can walk in off the street without having to make an appointment. And I'd like to argue today that supporting and developing a city that supports street commerce has a myriad of different economic, social, and environmental benefits, and should indeed be one of the goals in city development or reconstruction. I produced a book on this subject matter a couple of years ago called Street Commerce, Creating Vibrant Urban Sidewalks. And those of you who may be interested can hopefully access the book. If you cannot, you can email me and I can send you a PDF for more details on the subject than I can actually cover today. I have been to Ukraine a few times, and I know that street commerce is also a historic part of many cities. Here you see some scenes from Kiev, but it's something that of a quality that we find in any historic city throughout Europe. It's, I would argue, part and parcel of building inclusive, diverse, and also economically vital communities. However, since the 1990s, in many parts of Eastern Europe, we have observed a tendency for a lot of retail activity to cluster instead into large-scale shopping centers that are rather geared to be accessed by an automobile, by car. And those malls or shopping centers on the urban periphery have oftentimes produced a detrimental impact on city center street commerce. Because there is a limited amount of purchasing power in any city, there's direct competition between malls and in older city center streets with smaller retail patterns. I would like to argue that there are a number of critical benefits to small-scale street commerce rather than the auto-oriented shopping center development model. First, economically, small locally owned stores have a much larger economic multiplier effect on the local economy than big box stores. This is because small locally owned stores oftentimes procure and subcontract locally. They will get furniture for local providers, they will hire locally, they will subcontract their services more locally, they'll hire local transportation firms, et cetera, et cetera. One study in the United States found that, for instance, using bookstores as an example, a locally owned bookstore returned 74 cents out of each dollar to the local economy through these subcontracts that are locally procured. a chain bookstore with a large national chain only returned about 20 cents on the dollar to the local economy, and 80 cents on the dollar actually left the economy to other states and parts of the country where the company is owned. This is because large chain businesses typically have vertical integration, where they have integrated transportation services, procurement services, etc., whereas less benefit stays local. Second, on the environmental front, about 2/3 of all trips in cities are actually for personal, family, recreational, and social purposes. Only 1/3, or even less, 25% of all trips are home to work and back trips. Street commerce, broadly defined as retailers, service providers, cultural amenities, and so forth, are the kinds of places where so many of these trips, meetings, and social get-togethers can be conducted. And if street commerce offers a way of accessing places on foot or by public transport, it can produce large savings in the city's energy demand and carbon emissions. Making street commerce available on foot or by public transit can have huge benefits on carbon emissions, because so many trips can be conducted without having to drive across the city to a faraway shopping center. And third, on the social front, street commerce is the one kind of urban space that allows people to meet face-to-face, to meet each other or meet strangers. And I argue that this is absolutely fundamental to strengthening democracy. If we develop a society where we all move in private vehicles without encountering other members of our society face-to-face, we develop divisions and conflict over time. We need the kinds of urban spaces that put us in touch with others who we did not even plan to meet, but the city creates the opportunities to encounter different kinds of cuisines or businesses or restaurants, to encounter different kinds of people that we didn't plan to meet. It's fundamental for keeping a society together and strengthening democracy. So what I'll talk about today is an overarching argument captured in this diagram, that dense and mixed use kinds of urban development, where we prioritize subcenters and city centers, generate more foot traffic and public transit use, which in turn are highly beneficial for street commerce, small scale street facing retail and services, which contribute to place livelihoods and convenience, and in fact, in the long run, produce higher real estate value. I'll go over 5 points today. First, I will talk a little bit about the macro picture, the predictability, the commonalities of retail location patterns in a number of different cities. Then I'll turn to an economic view of retail density. What factors economically explain where and at what densities and patterns do we find retailers in a city? Then I'll go into clustering dynamics, why stores actually cluster. And then I'll talk about coordination or mechanisms that are sometimes called business associations or business improvement districts. And then I'll talk a little bit about policies that support street commerce in the conclusion. So first, the macro picture. It turns out that much of the retail location patterns we observe in any city is actually quite predictable. The kinds of things that are predictable are the number of stores we will find in a metropolitan area, the rank size hierarchy of retail clusters, that is, how many large clusters, medium-sized clusters, and small clusters of stores we find, as well as the location patterns of where these things tend to locate in a city. All three of these things are predictable and rather regular and can be measured and analyzed in a metropolitan area. So let's look at the number of stores, for example. Here I have plotted a relationship between the number of establishment on the vertical y-axis in US metropolitan areas. This graph contains 273 metropolitan areas in the United States, and on the x-axis, the population of those same metropolitan areas. What you see here is a very close relationship. The larger the metro area population, the more establishments it has. Both of the scales in this chart are in logarithmic scale because of the sizes are so far apart. So for example, if we take the Washington, Arlington, Alexandria metropolitan area, it has a population of 5.58 million people. The trend line here would predict that such a metropolitan area should have 46,500 stores. The actual number is slightly less, it's 41,000, but it's quite close. This just demonstrates that there is not that much variation from the metro area population to the number of stores. The number of stores is predicted by the purchasing power, which in turn is described by the population of the place. What about the rank size hierarchy? What do I mean by that? I mentioned that there are a predictable number of large clusters, smaller or medium-sized clusters, and small clusters. There is a trend called Zipf's law, which is broadly used in geography and economic geography that describes the rank size relationships between spatial phenomena. For instance, even in city sizes, it has been observed that in most countries, there is one or two dominant large cities, like in the case of Ukraine, Kiev. There are several medium-sized cities, and then there's a large amount of small cities. This trend also holds for retail clusters. In most cities, we find one or a couple dominant large retail centers with many stores, several medium-sized ones, and most common are small clusters. They are the most numerous in any city. So for instance, here's an image of the distribution of retail clusters in the city of Los Angeles, where you see the downtown area in the middle of the picture. These large circles describe the largest clusters of stores in the city. And the smaller the circle, the fewer stores there are in the cluster. Here is the picture of Washington, D.C. Here is the picture of Boston. What we see, the largest circles in downtown are areas called downtown Boston and Back Bay. And then we see some medium-sized circles and a whole lot more small circles. They follow an exponential distribution where there are very few large ones, many medium-sized ones, and a whole lot of very small clusters. This is a trend we observe in all cities, highly regular. For example, the Zipf's law in the United States would predict that a city like Arizona would have 25 clusters that have roughly 25 to 52 establishments, while the actual number we know from reality is 23, so it's quite precise. The trend also predicts about 9 clusters with 50 to 100 stores, while the actual number is 8. And the trend predicts that the number of clusters with 1 to 200 stores is 3, which exactly matches the number of clusters observed in Phoenix. No clusters over 4,000 stores is predicted in Zipf's law. However, there is one such dominant cluster. So this example underestimates the dominant cluster size for the city of Phoenix. However, for the most part, for most retail clusters, it predicts quite well their size rank distribution. And the third thing that is highly regular are location patterns. So if we have a certain amount of stores in a city, where they locate usually depends on the location accessibility. And if you know the population distribution and job distribution in a city, then the location patterns of retail centers and subcenters are also quite regular. However, despite these commonalities, these predictable patterns of retail locations, each city is also highly unique and individual. Its own look and feel and own character of street-based commercial economy depends on history, context, as well as conscious planning decisions. If you think about American cities like Los Angeles, Chicago, New York, Houston, Boston, San Francisco, then one of the key things people remember about these cities is what their streets feel like, what kinds of experiences people encountered while walking down the street, and oftentimes encountering these various kinds of service, retail, entertainment, recreational facilities. If I take the trend line I showed earlier about the number of establishments in any metropolitan area and zoom in onto the line, then we actually also see some scatter around that line if we look closely. For instance, I've highlighted two cities that are positive outliers on the y-axis. This basically means that they have many more retail and service and street commerce establishments than their population would predict. For instance, San Luis Obispo in California or Myrtle Beach in South Carolina. The reason why these two examples have many more stores is that they are tourist cities. San Luis Obispo is wine country, where many people travel as tourists for wine tasting, and the actual local population is fairly small. However, retail purchases are made by hordes of tourists who come to the place. So therefore, the town, so to speak, punches above its weight. It has many more stores than its local population would predict because of the influx of outside purchases. This is, of course, simple and logical, and we find such examples in any country, including in Ukraine. Let me pause for a second to see if there are any questions so far before I go into the economic view of retail densities. Do we have any questions of clarification that I should stop for?
Andres, we have a question. It is in our chat. If you can look in the chat box, it would be easier for you to perceive the information.
Okay. Yeah. Let me read that in German cities. Yeah, I do think that doing specific context-related research on calibrating such patterns is valuable for understanding. I mean, every country develops and varies to some extent. People have a different relationships to their commerce. Studies in the US versus Germany versus Ukraine versus in Estonia are going to turn out somewhat different coefficients for these relationships. However, overall, I do think that the same kinds of things are highly regular in all of these countries. The number of stores you will encounter for a metropolitan area will be predicted by its population very closely. The size hierarchy of the clusters, the fact that we have very few large clusters, some medium-sized clusters, and most of the clusters are very small, is a universal phenomenon we see all over the world. And once we know the population and job distribution, we can also fairly confidently predict where retail agglomerations will form. So the exact parameters and coefficients of these relationships can vary, but overall the trends, I think, are quite stable across countries. Oops. I hope that addresses. Let me see if I can turn the slide back for a second.
Тут важливий досвід сам в тому, що
the experience is important because the city takes responsibility, and generally they take some financing out of the business shoulders, and they also set the trend of the future requests for services, and it makes it more simple for business to get into the market. And I think that it's a nice example of the business support, because basically we form the canvas of services, of goods which correspond to the requests of the population of the tourists. So it looks like the system that enables to enhance capacities ought to calibrate them. For example, people use mobile phones. We need, for example, heart cases, etc., or repairments, or souvenirs when we talk about the tourists. So I think that this experience was pretty beneficial to understand the common responsibility for the business effectiveness in the long run.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And one other example, which I'll touch upon later, is cities oftentimes have to make policy decisions whether or not to permit new large-scale retail developments. For instance, shopping center permits. If we know the saturation capacity of a metropolitan area, and we know how many businesses there are already, then this understanding, these trends, these regularities can help us understand whether permitting new developments can actually hurt the existing ecosystem or it fulfills an unfulfilled niche, whether there is demand for more businesses that are not yet covered, or whether opening up new shopping centers on the urban fringe is going to hurt the small businesses that already exist. So that's maybe just another example of how these trends can actually be helpful in policy decisions. So if I would next talk a little bit about what we know economically about factors that directly or most directly affect retail densities. I will only cover some of the major ones. There are many more that I discuss in my book, but I will do this via a simple urban economic model. This model was developed by Denis Di Pascali and William Wheaton in the 1990s, and it illustrates the density of retailers, or what we call the capital D here, reflects the distance between stores. So it's the inverse of density. The larger the distance, the lower the density. The smaller the distance, higher the density. It explains the distances of competing stores with 4 interrelated factors. Capital C stands for fixed costs of operating retail facilities. K stands for transportation costs. V stands for frequency of purchases for a given trip or good type or given type of commodity. And capital F stands for customer density. That is the density of homes or workplaces in a city where trips for retail purchases originate from. I will illustrate each of these 4 factors with some images rather than dig into the equation here. What you can already see from the equation is that the C is on the denominator of the index. That means that it is proportional to the distance between stores. If fixed costs of running a business go up, then we get fewer stores and the distance between stores increases. Therefore, the capital D grows. However, K, V, and F are in the denominator of the index. That means that they are inversely proportional to the distance between stores. So if transportation costs increase, if the frequency of purchases increases for a particular type of good, or if customer density grows, then the distance between stores shrinks and the density increases. So let's look at this more closely. I did some work in Southeast Asia when I lived in Singapore and did a lot of work with the World Bank in Indonesia. It is very clear that much of the Indonesian economy is based off of very small, very low-cost retail operations. Basically, kiosks run on bicycles. This is an example where the fixed costs for operating of a business are extremely low because it takes one person to operate the business. They procure the food, they cook the food, they even do the dishes. And this kind of very low-cost operation has produced a very high density of service providers. Because the fixed costs are very low, the density between stores is high and the distance between stores is low. I know from Ukraine too, traditionally there are lots of markets in some of the cities. This is another example. Markets are relatively cheap to operate on particular selling desk. and we get a very high density of vendors in such contexts. However, if in very high price locations, we observe high fixed costs. This example here comes from Bleecker Street in New York, which is one of these examples where there was an astronomical increase in retail rents over a short period of time. Then many businesses went out. Even the luxury brands that stayed initially couldn't afford the location anymore, and we obtained what became known as retail blight or retail mass vacancy due to excessively high costs of operating rents. The second factor has to do with customer density. This is relatively obvious. If you have a high density of people around the city, if you're building a mixed-use high-density city, you will get low distance between stores and a high density of stores. The most extreme example of this that I have a photo of comes from Hong Kong. There are parts of Hong Kong where the population density is the highest in the whole world, 200,000 people per square kilometer. And you will have retail patterns where the stores go up all the way to the 10th floor without an elevator. People will walk up the stairs to get to shops and services that are 7, 8, 9 stories up above the ground level. And this is purely or predominantly explained by extreme population densities in such areas. However, when customer density is low, then we obtain long distances between stores, and oftentimes stores agglomerate into large footprint shopping centers that have a large catchment area for the whole metropolitan area or region. So this example actually comes from Tallinn, Estonia, where we've also witnessed a development of large-scale suburban shopping malls, which now have become a real problem because they're unsustainable and they have hurt the city centers, and they require pretty much only access by car. And so we have a few of those that are far apart, each one with a very large catchment area. So retail density is low. Stores are far apart because population density in suburbs is also low. Now, an interesting example is the frequency of purchases for different kinds of stores. Those kinds of places that people go to very often, like, for instance, the bakeries in Paris, or in any country, restaurants and eateries are some of the most frequently visited places, we find much more often in the city. The distances between stores are small and the density is high. On the flip side, for very infrequently or very rarely purchased goods, we find a very sparse pattern in the city. So here's an example of a very specialized store in London, which sells full-scale taxidermy animals. These are basically stuffed animals from hunting trophies. And this is a very highly specialized kind of good. And in fact, in London, you will only find a couple of such stores, 1 or 2 stores for the entire metropolitan area that sells taxidermy goods, because it actually requires roughly a 10 million person catchment area to support one such stores, because people go very infrequently and most people never go to such stores, right? I've plotted here as a reference from the book how many people on average is required for each type of store using data from the United States. At the bottom of the scale are the most frequent stores, what we see most commonly in city streets, where a relatively low number of people is sufficient to support the store. So at the bottom of this are restaurants and eating places. On average in US cities, there is 1 restaurant per 450 people. Very low number. And we see such places all over the place because this is some of the most frequently visited kind of place, because most of us need to eat 3 meals a day. We don't always do it outside. We often eat at home, but in aggregate, the population generates so many trips to eating places, coffee shops, and other food-related establishments. Personal care services like hair cutters, beauty salons, and so forth also are very common, about 600 or 700 people per establishment. But on the other extreme, on the top of the list, you see things like lawn and gardening stores. And on average, these kinds of stores require a catchment of about 15,000 people per store. So we don't find very many of them. And you can see the intermediary list down below. Lastly, the fourth factor that I mentioned on this has to do with transportation costs. And this is one of the factors that I think city government has the most influence over. It sounds a little bit unusual that we can control transportation costs. Actually, we cannot control oil prices. We cannot control transportation costs directly, but indirectly, city planning and city design decisions have a very strong influence on moving or mobility in the city. The model I described argues that when transportation costs are high, then the distance between stores is low and the density of stores is high. The best example of this is Venice, Italy, showed on the picture here. In Venice, Italy, there are no cars whatsoever. It's a city that never had cars and it's protected itself from it. When you walk in a city, we say that transportation costs are very high because it's very costly to move a long distance. Transportation costs include time, and when you walk, it takes you a long time to cover a kilometer or 2 or 3. So in Venice, everybody walks. There are no cars, or sometimes they take a boat. But with these kinds of transportation costs that are very high per mile or per kilometer, we see a very dense pattern of street commerce in the city. And on the flip side, when you develop a city with automotive infrastructure that makes it very easy to travel long distance in a short amount of time, we see a drop in retail density and an increase in the distance between stores, just like the equation predicted. So in car-oriented cities where we make it really easy for people to travel long distance, we build large road infrastructure for vehicles, and we support the procurement or purchase of personal automobiles in the society. We end up influencing the retail patterns of a city. In general, it's cheap to cross long distances by car, and we get large shopping centers. That's the kind of retail pattern that this produces. On the other hand, in walkable and transit-oriented cities, this picture here comes from Zurich in Switzerland, a city that has excellent world-class public transportation in the form of streetcars or tramways and is highly walkable in its center. We get dense retail patterns of small stores on city streets, not large shopping centers on the fringes. So in transit-oriented, in more walkable cities, patronage of stores or visitations to stores depends on proximity. People come from close by, and this produces a larger number of smaller destinations, more small-scale stores on city streets. On the other hand, automotive infrastructure promotes fewer and larger shopping center type of retail places. So I think through decisions in planning and infrastructure in city governments, we can indirectly affect the viability of small-scale street-based retail commerce if we promote public transportation and if we promote dense urban development where we can walk between places, like the image here from Copenhagen. There's a certain vicious cycle or self-fulfilling cycle that can go either way towards on the left-hand side, if we want to achieve a denser, more street-focused retail pattern, which many European cities now try to achieve, this requires higher densities of development, more residents, more jobs per square kilometer, which in turn makes typical trips in the city shorter. People travel shorter distances between places. That promotes more walking and public transit use, and that in turn promotes a denser retail pattern. On the other hand, if we develop a city along lower density settings, facilitate urban sprawl on the edges, this will result in longer average trips, a high automobile mode share, and correspondingly a sparser pattern of retail concentrated in shopping centers. In many Eastern European cities, and I would imagine also in Ukraine, there has been a strong tendency towards automobility since the 1990s. This is in part explained by the fact that until the 1990s, there was a deficit or artificial constraint on car ownership. However, after a certain point in the late 90s, in most Eastern European countries, motorization already caught up to European averages and surpassed it. For instance, the country I am currently in Estonia, motorization already is well past the European average, which has become a real policy problem. The country is struggling with meeting its climate change and public health targets because of excessive car ownership, excessive motorization. And I would like to argue that the motorization that happened here and in other Eastern European countries is in part influenced by policy. In the 1990s, the government here actually directly promoted car-oriented urban sprawl by using taxpayer money to build out car infrastructure into the suburbs and subdividing large lots of land for single-family homes. This was something that the government of Estonia did willingly in the 1990s, and something that currently today is oftentimes a regret because we cannot afford to maintain such low density development. Also, such sprawl is facilitated by the lack of investment into public transportation and transit networks. So trains, tramways, buses, that if they're not properly supported and grown over the period of time, they inadvertently fuel more motorization by car, which fuels the shopping center model rather than the street commerce model. Oftentimes, there's also a decoupling between urban policies like zoning from public transit accessibility. In many Western European countries, parking requirements and development rights are directly connected to public transit accessibility. If you have good public transit accessibility at a certain location, you have to build much less parking and you can build more or higher developments. This is a kind of land use and urban form policy that directly supports denser and more walkable street commerce. And if it's not in place, it will inadvertently support car-oriented developments. There also have been too few investments in many Eastern European cities, and probably also Ukraine, even before the war, before the occupation, into pedestrian-oriented streets. We oftentimes have spent a lot of more money in Eastern Europe on streets for vehicles, streets to facilitate the growth of car ownership, rather than streets for pedestrians, cyclists, and public transit. And also, there's been a lack of proper planning instruments to actually do master planning around a vision that is more dense, pedestrian-oriented and transit-oriented development that promotes street commerce. I will pause here for a minute as well to see if there's any ongoing questions before I go on to the topic of clustering between stores. Okay. Are there any questions before we go on, or should I keep going? Okay. If not,
Там є одне
then...
питання, але його можна до кінця віднести пізніше, не перериваючись.
There is a question, but we can discuss it later without pausing right now.
Okay, great. So if you noticed, if you look carefully, then this model of retail densities that I explained, where we had these four factors: customer density, frequency of visits, transportation costs, and fixed costs, it explained the density of competing stores, like how dense are the patterns of restaurants, how dense are patterns of grocery stores, one category at a time. But it didn't provide any reasons why stores would cluster together. However, if you look around any city, you're probably well familiar that stores oftentimes cluster. So the question is why? Why do stores cluster? There are two broad reasons. There are exogenous, external reasons, and there are endogenous, internal reasons why clustering occurs, especially in retail businesses. For exogenous reasons, this oftentimes has to do with uneven or variable accessibility. The one-dimensional model that I explained above, if laid out along a linear line, as in the upper diagram here, forecast that stores will be evenly spaced apart, where this capital D distance between stores will be the same between different stores. So it predicts like an even spread of supermarkets in the city, or haircutters, or whatever business. But this assumes also a very simplified view of a city on a linear line where population density and accessibility are uniform. If we transform this single line into a cross shape, so that it's there's a center point, and otherwise we maintain the same length, the same amount of people along the line, then we can already see that even this same very model would lead to a certain form of exogenous clustering at the center of the diagram. This basically illustrates that places of better accessibility, where more people can easily approach from further distances, ought to expect to have higher retail densities. And that's the reality. Cities are not uniform, unvariable places. Cities have some locations that are much more accessible than others, whether it's in historic city centers that are central, or whether it's due to transportation infrastructure that makes it easier for the larger amount of people to arrive at a certain place. And sometimes it's the subway station or public transit networks that give access to certain places from faraway catchment areas. I'm using an example here in Tallinn, where there's a large shopping center outside of the historic city center. This is called the Christina Center, and it's right on a major arterial road that connects to a big part of Tallinn in front of it, and there's a train line right next to it. So it's simply an example of the location itself has much higher accessibility than many other competing locations in the city, and it's a place where a shopping center has developed. But besides these exogenous reasons, besides the fact that some places are more accessible and approached by more people, so stores take advantage of that cluster, there are also internal or endogenous reasons why stores choose to cluster. Those two divide into two separate categories. There's complementary clustering and competitive clustering. Complementary clustering is very intuitive. It's easy to understand that, for instance, an ice cream cafe and a theater might want to co-locate to the same place, because people who go to the theater may want to eat ice cream before or after. Or different kinds of grocery sellers, a fishmonger and a fruit store or a wine store may want to co-locate because they complement each other, and it makes it simpler for the customer to do more things on a same trip. So it's in the interest of the customer to go to clusters that offer complementary goods, and stores respond by clustering. However, perhaps the more interesting example is competitive clustering, where stores that compete with each other directly also choose to cluster together. I'll tell you a quick example from a city building experiment in Brazil that illustrates this form of competitive clustering. In 1956, the government of Brazil decided to establish a new capital city called Brasilia. It was designed by Lúcio Costa and Oscar Niemeyer, two famous architects, and their design was premised on a feature called the superblock, or supercuadra in Spanish. Superblock is kind of similar to the Soviet-era microrayon idea. It's basically a cluster of about 3,000 homes in the same district. And what the architects thought is that each superblock should have its own autonomous retail provisions. This is a diagram that illustrates. On the lower diagram, you see this kind of horizontal strip of stores that each superblock was supposed to have its own. And on the upper diagram, you see that it's on the edge of a superblock and it's kind of facing the other strip across the road. The access to these retail strips in each superblock were supposed to be from the side of the superblock where it's on. So for instance, for this black strip on the top of the diagram, the access was coming from above, from the homes that are to the north. For the strip that's on the bottom, the access was from the south. so that people who live in the superblock can see the stores, etc. This was the plan that was actually built out in the early 1960s. What happened? Two things. First of all these autonomous strips that were provided by the architects flipped around. So rather than attracting customers from the side of the superblock, all stores turned inside out and actually opened towards where the deliveries were supposed to come from, where the trucks were supposed to bring the goods from. So here you can see a double-sided retail strip that works as a two-sided street rather than being the backside of the stores. This was possible because the architecture of the buildings actually allowed that kind of conversion at a fairly low cost. And second, what happened in Brasilia is that all these strips specialized. Some of them became pharmacy streets, some of them became flower streets, some of them became restaurant streets. So rather than every strip providing all kinds of daily convenience good in every superblock, each edge of the superblock became a specialized strip. Why? Why did this happen? This has to do with endogenous clustering. The competitive clustering I was alluding to stems from the literature around this from three interrelated reasons. One is a theory that Harold Hotelling developed in the 1920s and 30s, which is basically that for stores that have low moving costs, it's in the interests of stores to co-locate with each other, because otherwise they risk having their competitors change their location. He used the example of ice cream vendors on the beach, and he said that even though socially optimal solution would be to have the ice cream vendors on the beach at a reasonable distance from each other, at the 1/3 location, 2/3 locations of the beach, there's a separate kind of equilibrium can emerge where the ice cream vendors will be right next to each other. And it's worse for customers because customers have to walk longer distances, but it avoids the risk of the competitors moving without your own store moving. So that's an old historic theory. More importantly, there are many kinds of goods where people want to conduct price and product comparison. Clothing stores, bookstores, even restaurants. Oftentimes people prefer to go to a place where they can examine a few separate alternatives before they make their choice. This is called price and product comparison, and it happens very commonly amongst many kinds of competitive goods. And since people prefer to do that, stores respond and offer this choice to people. It lowers people's search costs and provides a strong advantage to go towards these clusters from the consumer perspective. Also, it's been found as a third reason that in competitive clusters like food clusters, clothing clusters, bookstore clusters, shoe stores clusters, and so forth, prices tend to be lower through competition. And it is another reason why competitive clustering occurs. I have studied this myself in the context of Boston area. And the kinds of stores that are most likely to cluster with their competitors include sporting goods, hobby, book, and music stores. In fact, if you've traveled to other cities around Europe, you'll probably have noticed that very commonly bookstores cluster, sporting stores cluster, music stores cluster for the same reason. This is the kind of place where people want to compare their goods before they make decisions. Also, food services and drinking places. This is restaurants. They also they had the second highest clustering coefficient, very commonly clustered. And third and fourth, electronic stores and clothing stores. But what does not cluster are supermarkets, because people generally do not want to engage in product comparison, go to one supermarket and then also go to another supermarket to see the kinds of products they offer. Generally, food and beverage stores are direct competitors with each other, and they locate apart from each other. They compete over market areas. And also in the US, we have a category called miscellaneous store retailers. These are kind of the general stores, CVS, Walgreens, and some others, which provide, they're a little bit like small supermarkets and pharmacies combined. They provide all kinds of standard convenience goods that people need on a daily basis. They are not specialized. They don't have clothing. They don't have apparel and shoes. And these are also the kinds of stores that we found no clustering evidence. They tend to locate apart from each other. So those are some of the economic reasons for why clustering occurs. But sometimes stores deliberately coordinate and establish clusters. So a shopping center is actually a perfect example of coordinated retail clustering, because there's generally one owner or one owning real estate investment trust or management company that runs the whole shopping center. And then they have the opportunity to coordinate and orchestrate the most profitable mix of stores for their given location. Street commerce, however, with small independent vendors, usually is uncoordinated. That means that every shop has a different owner, has a different tenant, and they do not coordinate their decisions. They do not coordinate what kind of store is going to go next door, how much rent they pay. Each landowner charges whatever rent they can. And this is one of the core disadvantages that makes it hard for urban street-based retailers to compete against shopping centers, because shopping centers have this capability to offer very low rents to high foot traffic stores, what are called anchor stores, and charge high rents from smaller businesses that benefit from the spillovers from anchor stores. If we look at the actual sales volumes from shopping centers and urban clusters, we see that there are higher, this is data that I've analyzed from Los Angeles in 2010. We see that the average sales volume per business establishment are higher in shopping centers because of this very highly orchestrated cluster that is selective of which stores can come and go. And the shopping center stores usually tend to be also brand or chain stores that spend considerable amount on advertising. There are well-known brands which have a bigger draw, whereas in city streets, we have fewer well-known brands and therefore less expenditure on advertising and marketing. And for each type of category of stores, whether retailers, food and beverage places, or services, we see lower sales per store. So that's expected in some ways. But at the same time, these uncoordinated street-based retailers have many public benefits. They make the city a better place, a more pleasant, more livable, more interesting place for citizens. They also tend to be more economically resilient to downturns. So sometimes when things go bad, like the COVID epidemic arrived, or pandemic, when the shopping center shut down, sometimes the city lost all of its retail, or sometimes a district of a city lost all of its opportunity, whereas in small businesses, they tend to be more resilient over time, and not everybody goes out at the same time. There's also more shared wealth creation, as I mentioned earlier, and they generally tend to support a better quality of public space that truly is open to everyone in a public way. So there are these two kinds of historic differences. The shopping center, which is coordinated entity where one management company or investment trust owns the whole place and coordinates and orchestrates the kinds of stores that are there. And separately, street commerce, which is diverse, fragmented, has many different owners, and does not have the same kind of coordination as a shopping center. However, there's an intermediary category. There's a category of business improvement districts. This is an example, actually, of well, before I get to the business improvement districts, there are examples of a similar model as a shopping center, one owner owning a whole district, but not coordinating the stores. This is a district in Tallinn called the Rotermani quarters in the very city center, the old historic factory district that is now a kind of a high-end retail area. This has largely one owner. It's run by a large developer, and they haven't actually engaged in a high degree of coordination. They sort of run it as if this is fragmented, which has been one of the key problems why they haven't been able to attract some of the most important anchors to this place. There's another typology that I'm guessing is also observed in Ukraine, where some of the former factories are turned into more creative clusters. This one happens to be the Brick or Telliskivi creative cluster in Tallinn. And this one also has a single owner for all the buildings, and all the space is owned by a single company. But this one has a high degree of coordination. They very much orchestrate the kinds of businesses they want here and make them complementary to each other, and it has had a great deal of success. This place is much more successful financially and socially than this place. The kind of example that I've shown from Estonia here is also very common in many parts of Europe. This is from Copenhagen, the North Harbor development, where this is developed by the city, but there's a few very large real estate companies like the NREP company that own a large real estate holdings here, and they engage in coordination of ground floor retail. They've orchestrated and carefully planned small-scale street commerce into this area through coordinated action. And we see this as a very common model in Western Europe now too, places like London, Berlin, Paris, and Madrid. Large-scale developments with very specific plans to orchestrate and coordinate the ground floor commerce to generate foot traffic, and frankly, the livelihoods that are generated on the ground floor generate more value for the real estate that's upstairs, so the buildings also become more profitable. However, I want to emphasize that between this sort of uncoordinated and fragmented street commerce and highly coordinated shopping center, there is this thing called business improvement districts or business associations. This is an interesting concept that's not very common in Eastern Europe, but is very common in the US and increasingly common in Western Europe too, in the UK and other parts of Europe. What the business improvement districts are an interesting financial model. They basically introduce a public-private partnership to take care and support a specific area of the city. They do events and marketing for the district. They do cleanup and maintenance and security. They do public space improvements and even recruitment for new businesses if there are vacancies. This is an example of how a business improvement district works. This is one in New York City called the 23rd Street Flatiron Partnership. Basically, the property owners within a certain cordon have to agree that they want to establish a business improvement district. Usually a 2/3 majority is required to go ahead. And if they establish the business improvement district, then all the properties inside the cordon, inside the boundary, have to pay additional property taxes on top of the city taxes. The city still collects these taxes on behalf of the improvement district, but they give the money back to the improvement district that they collect. And the improvement district has a board which decides how to spend it. And they spend it on area improvements. So they are public-private partnerships because the city helps them do tax collection, but they are privately deciding how to spend it. They have an elected board that usually includes a city government on the board as well to warrant public interest. They usually have to have 2/3 majority approval in order to start one or form one, and they typically have a 5-year cycle. So each approval is good for about 5 years. And if approved, then every property owner inside the area has to pay without choice. It's not voluntary, it's required by law. They have to pay additional property taxes, which basically raises funding for the common good to spend on area improvements. The kinds of services I already mentioned, they do involve extra street cleaning, marketing for the area, advertising, public space improvement like furniture, lighting, landscaping and flowers, new tenant recruitments for vacancies, grants to small businesses, and sometimes they coordinate even opening hours to make sure that the different stores are open during the same time. In other words, they are making fragmented street commerce operate a little bit more like a shopping center where everything is coordinated. So it's a way, or it's a mechanism to even the playing field to some extent. However, and there's so many of them. For instance, in Los Angeles, if you look at the business improvement district map, they are everywhere in downtown. Every piece of downtown is covered by some or another business improvement district. This has been one of the key mechanisms for revitalizing downtown LA after the early 90s earthquake and also riots that occurred in the city back then. However, it's not entirely clear from the empirical literature how beneficial for the businesses the bids are. I compare here on the left side or right side of my screen, and try to hide these controls. Here on the chart on the right, I compare the sales per employee or per person in the business improvement districts versus non-business improvement districts in the Los Angeles area, and they are not very different. Maybe they would be even more different if there were no bids at the same locations, because the businesses have already spent more expenditure on upkeep, on marketing, on spatial improvements, and that consumes some of their budgets. So maybe the difference would exist without bids, but bids don't necessarily generate more revenue like a shopping center does, that I showed earlier. So in the form of a diagram, basically business improvement districts operate as a third category that's different from shopping centers, and that's different from the fragmented independent stores that do not coordinate at all. It's a mixture of the two. There are still individual store ownerships. Each property owner can still decide how to run their own stores, but they all pay extra property taxes to generate some common funds for common improvements. So let me conclude by arguing that many Eastern European cities have faced this dilemma of what kind of a city they want to become, what kind of a city they want to develop. Oftentimes, the liberal market trend is to push towards car-oriented developments and shopping centers. But much of Western Europe instead is pushing towards public transit-oriented, walkable, and people-centric cities with small-scale retail along city streets. If a city wants to contribute or move towards this Western European model of small-scale street commerce and more walkable and public transit-oriented streets, then there are a number of decisions or policies that can support that. Creating more housing, more affordable housing for families in particular in the city center, not in the suburbs, but where the amenities and transportation solutions already lie, will help. Investing into public transport, buses, trams, and metro lines will certainly help. Prioritizing pedestrians and bikes and public transit on street redesigns or traffic designs helps. Reducing or removing parking requirements in areas that have good public transit service will help. Promoting higher densities of development near transit stations, allowing the allowable buildings to be taller and bigger where public transit is good, will help. Requiring that ground floor businesses in new buildings, that new buildings that are developed in central locations will already have spaces configured for ground floor businesses by regulation or by law, will help. Exploring these sorts of business improvement districts or business associations that I illustrated can be interesting, especially in areas where they lack municipal services and need extra budget for security, for street improvements, for marketing or recruitment. I think it's equally important to develop very clear development plans for urban centers, where, especially in large-scale developments, to have a clear public vision of what these places should be in the future. Having a clear plan also helps. and limiting the permits for new suburban shopping centers will certainly have a positive impact on city center commerce because, again, the purchasing power in a city is always limited and not infinite, and stores will fundamentally compete with each other. Finally, to prevent urban sprawl on the edges, considering urban growth boundaries and supporting more center city development can also help, which is a policy that several European cities, like many cities in the Netherlands, in London, historically have implemented urban growth boundaries in order to support denser inner city development. So with that, thank you, and I'm happy to take some questions.
У нас є декілька питань, вони всі в
We
чаті.
have a few questions. They are all in the
Якщо можна,
chat
там три
box.
питання у нас є.
There are 3 questions, if you may read them. Yeah, please have a look.
Great. I see one question saying, do store owners participate in the improvements of the area around the stores? Yes. So fundamentally, the property owners are responsible for contributing taxes to the business improvement district, not the tenants, but the property owners. However, large businesses, even small businesses, can be on the board of a business improvement district and therefore decide how to spend the common funds. So in business improvement districts, oftentimes businesses are represented on the board, and they help explain or they help allocate the funds to kinds of activities that benefit stores. I hope that answers. For instance, oftentimes marketing and recruitment is key. So if certain businesses lose a tenant, they need to reach out and spend a lot of money finding tenants, and the business improvement district can help with that, or public space improvements, or facade improvements, and such things. A second question I see here is, what is medium duration for transformation of a typical gray street in the shining street with developed street commerce? How long does it take to transform? Well, this really depends. A lot can be done with quick strategic changes. So sometimes we observe a street may be in a very central location, but it is disadvantaged because it has a loud traffic corridor, and people just don't like to be in the midst of car traffic and when the sidewalks are small. So some cities, what they've done is, in very cheap ways, actually reduced the vehicular traffic capacity and increased the walkable sidewalks on a street to improve the pedestrian experience. This can be done even with bollards and paint without completely reconstructing the street. And that in itself, if the location is already advantageous, can do a very quick positive impact on the accessibility and servicing of the stores on that street. Another example of a quick fix or temporary fix is what's quite popular in some of the US cities now is to organize what are called car-free Sundays on historic shopping streets. They basically will say that every Sunday, traffic is completely forbidden. And they bring play equipment, sometimes music, sometimes they allow restaurants to spill out onto the street. And it only lasts a day, but if it happens routinely, it builds consciousness. People will remember, they will start building habits, they will go back to the historic city center streets, and it'll bring life back. And these are very quick fix solutions. For longer term things, usually a more coordinated strategy is needed. Both infrastructure needs to be improved, public transit access, proper sidewalks and lighting and street infrastructure, furniture, and the business strategy needs to be coordinated amongst the ground floors. Sometimes city governments actually take that role. So what I showed with the business improvement districts, in some examples, like in the city of London, with the borough governments, which are district governments, play the same role. They actively help to fill vacant storefronts. They will spend municipal money to bring in valuable stores for the community. and sometimes even rent out spaces with the public budget to bring in something that's missing, like a community grocery store, if the market doesn't produce that. So city government can also play the kind of role that the bids perform. I see another question. In today's military reality in Ukraine, the development of commercial spaces is the most promising underground for security reason. How do you look at this? Yeah, this is tricky and challenging. I think if we asked this question 5 years ago, nobody would have promoted underground shopping. The new reality is much more complicated. I think at the times of peace, underground facilities are not desirable. On the ground urban space in historic streets.
А чи є щось схоже з ізраїльським досвідом? Чи є досвід, можна застосувати досвід Ізраїлю, який має схожі...
Can we use the Israeli experience? They have similar problems of constant threats. How you maybe try to figure how you try to learn about their experience and how they're doing it.
Right. I personally have not worked at all in Israel, but I know some other cities where there are extensive networks of indoor or underground shopping too. Singapore is one. It has a whole underground master plan that is high level and very extensive. Montreal, Canada has what's called an underground city, basically many shopping centers all interconnected with each other underground. It's very expensive to do this. It's not a cheap endeavor. However, if the threat of war is persistent and not temporary, obviously this could be a serious consideration. So I have not worked on this myself, but I think at least critical services may warrant such protection. I don't know if, because underground construction is so incredibly expensive, usually the dispersal, having small clusters in many places rather than a one large cluster in the city center may be another way of providing security while also satisfying the daily needs. I see another question. The city of Český Krumlov from 1253. The city authorities buy up buildings in the city center, and the authorities themselves form requests and offer tenants the topics of business and take on the responsibilities of supporting development. The popularity of ancient city, and thus city owners speak of such a model as a preservation of the ancient part of the city. Yes, this is a great example. It reminds me a little bit about what the borough governments of London have also been doing. For instance, the Camden city government in London has also been buying up real estate and taking a very active role in revitalizing certain streets, filling vacancies, and also constructing public space that benefits both stores and visitors alike. So I think if the city government is well run and serves the public interest, this is a very interesting strategy because it can directly support the public interest. Markets don't necessarily do that. Market-oriented retail development is really interested in maximum profits, which does not necessarily mean better public space for the city. Maximum profits are usually developed in inward-looking shopping centers, not investing into better sidewalks and public spaces. So I think it's a very interesting strategy. I see another question. What's the typical approach for promoting local producers through SME development, through street commerce development? That's a great question. I mean, first of all, local store owners and independent stores have a natural tendency to procure more locally. They tend to not go to the large integrated national companies for transportation and procurement. They tend to have more local networks naturally without even any additional effort. So normally small scale local stores will directly be more beneficial for the local economy. But what in terms of approaches, I think the kinds of buy local advertising campaigns can be quite powerful. This has been a strong movement in many countries where local restaurants and stores take a lot of pride in the fact that they procure all their food from the local area, they put it on the wall, and the customers can see it, and they say, this comes from this shop, this comes from this farm, this comes from this county. And they don't just do it, but they also tell it as part of their story. And I think that has been quite popular, that I've seen in Europe, but also in the US. So sort of buy local campaign, I think, builds a lot of pride in people. City government can also be helpful in that regard. Sometimes city government has opportunities to use advertising space in the city to support small businesses that do that. Sometimes, I don't know how the situation is in Ukraine, but even if you have big vendors like JC Deco or Clear Channel who manage advertising in the city, oftentimes city governments reserve a right to use some of that advertising for public purposes, which is one form of kind of helping small business promote. And in the US context, I must emphasize that many municipalities give out very sizable subsidies to business development. Unfortunately, these subsidies usually go to very large businesses. So, for instance, IKEA or some other big box store that comes to town and says, well, we would like to operate a store here, but we need you to build the infrastructure for us. So why don't you build the roads and the canalization or water supplies and so forth? So we will set up the store. That can cost taxpayers a lot of money to do that. And the same size subsidy oftentimes actually produces more economic benefit if distributed to several small stores than one large store. But in practice, at least in the US, a lot of politicians like the opportunity to cut the ribbon in front of a very big store or a new big business that comes to town. In reality, the economic benefits of these large subsidies have tended to be less pronounced or less successful than originally oftentimes told. What's the typical approach for renovating facades if they really look in a bad way? I've seen two common approaches. One is that sometimes city governments have a small business support program for facade improvements. For instance, in Boston, where I live, the city gives small grants to businesses to improve their facades. They also expect that in those improvements, they do something for the public, like, for instance, provide handicap access, wheelchair access. And if they comply with code, the city has a whole program available for this. Second, these business improvement districts have, if you are part of one, they too have facade improvement programs in place. These are the two that come to mind. But outside of the box, I would also think that a lot of creative thinkers, young architects in Ukraine and so forth, probably have really great ideas of how to do things very cheap with stores. So forming some sort of a task force or program to help design better shop fronts, even if it's really low cost. Oftentimes, it's not the question of just having a huge amount of money to do a fancy facade with glass and steel and electric advertising. Sometimes big transformation can be done very cheap, and it just takes some creative thinking around that. So I think that there's also maybe a hidden potential to engage young, talented architects into this process.
Andres, one question is, do you have any good experience, a good example in Baltic countries like Estonia, Lithuania, Latvia, which renovated this post-Soviet architecture and transforming them to more vibrant streets with active pedestrian zone, with street commerce? So maybe they pass through this way. What's their approach? I mean, especially in Baltic countries for post-Soviet transformation.
Yeah, that's a big question. and an important one because there's so many people, a very large proportion of people who live in these typologies, right? It's a big topic here in Estonia. To be honest, the first priority is not the retail vibrancy. The first priority is building renovation, which we have a national program. So basically, the Estonian government created a fund, which is basically a borrowing or a loan fund. These buildings were privatized in the 90s. They all have a condo association, which basically all the owners are part of the association. They own the condo association. Together, condo associations can borrow at very cheap rates funding from the government to weatherize, to basically improve the insulation and weather capacity of these buildings, and to also make them aesthetically nicer. So we've had this program in place for a number of years now. Many thousands of buildings have been renovated this way. Quite nice. I mean, you see very similar renovations in Germany where they've taken the old Soviet blocks and turned them around. Second phase that we're currently struggling with is more advanced, which is elevator provision and common facilities, and also things like bicycle parking or rooms you can rent out for birthday celebrations or community events. This requires not just renovation, it requires new construction. So we're currently in Estonia trying to figure out how to finance this. Elevators are very expensive, and unfortunately, these old Soviet era buildings are all designed so minimally that each stairwell requires its own elevator. It's very hard to share them. You know, you cannot put one elevator and then 3 staircases share that. We have now some examples of elevator provision too, that the social reality is that there are a lot of elderly populations who are stuck otherwise in high-rise apartments. And when they're ill or very old, they can no longer walk the stairs, and it's a big social problem. So elevators are critical, and now it's the second priority for government to provide those. I would argue that a more holistic approach would involve some sort of not just a pure private initiative from the condo association, but a stronger involvement of city government. Better examples come from Germany. Berlin city government, for instance, has been actively redesigning some of these Soviet era panel neighborhoods. They've even reduced some of their heights, removed some floors, taken off some of the panels, made the buildings lower. They have introduced new ground floor commercial spaces and sometimes even jobs or workplaces in the residential neighborhood. One of the big problems is that these districts are almost 100% residential and nothing else, right? So we need to figure out ways of how to bring jobs and make them more mixed use so that people can have local opportunities. I think some of the better examples of that are in Germany. And I also oftentimes mention Vienna in Austria as an excellent example, because they have been building social housing with really good provisions and services for about 100 years. There's a great book by Yves Blau from Harvard University on this from Vienna. And Vienna has, even today, a very strong non-profit housing sector. Actually, a lot of people in Vienna live in social housing. And it's just one of the kind of a best example. I know it's far removed from the social context, but I think that's the kind of end destination to look forward to, and then figure out which pieces one can actually do along the way. I'll also mention that what's kind of it's important besides. So I think that in Ukraine, I'm guessing a lot of these old panel houses, they are the de facto affordable housing, right? A lot of the new construction is probably luxury or high end, very expensive and not affordable to families. And these older districts tend to be the affordable supplies of housing. I think it's very important that there's some consideration of also requiring affordable commercial and residential space from new construction. This is also a topic that has become very important in Estonia when real estate developers build new projects. Right now, they don't have to do any affordable housing. And this whole concept of what is affordable housing in the US is very, and also in Western Europe, in Holland, in France, in Spain, in England, is very clearly defined. It basically means that certain percentage of apartments have to be available at an affordable price or affordable rent to tenants who will not spend more than 1/3 of their income on housing. And the real estate projects basically have to have something like 20 or 30 or sometimes even 40% of all their units set aside for affordable development, and which is of course in the long run very important, because otherwise wherever you have new development, it will be all very high end and luxurious, and then the lower income people will live in the outskirts, in the historic panel neighborhoods, and it will bifurcate the city into a very unequal pattern. And so requiring some of those affordable rules up front will avoid the long-term problems that come 10, 20 years and down the line. Okay, I think, are we roughly at the time mark here, or I don't know, Oleg, you probably have an idea of how long people have provisioned.
Так, ми дуже, я бачу, як сьогоднішня лекція.
Yes, I can see that today's lecture has been very comprehensive, a lot of interesting information. It's important for us to know your experience. And in post-Soviet Union era, we have a lot of similar experiences, especially in Baltic countries, and something similar to what is going on now here. But the specifics of everything that we've been discussing, we should take into account that Ukraine will live during the wartime. So we have to think how to, use your experience in terms of like safety principle. This is something that we are expecting during the following decades in the future. We do not know what awaits us. That's why the situation might be a bit different. When it comes to other things, your lecture provides us with the opportunity to look at the commerce that you can actually predict it. And when it comes to newly liberated countries, when there is renovation, we can use certain algorithms so that we can understand that this commerce is important for economy. It's a kind of social framework of a city. And this is something how we can demonstrate our authenticity. So thank you very much for your finding your time to share it with us, because it's important when we will have renovation stage, when it's important for us to have this expertise. Thank you, and thanks to your colleagues that joined in. And it's nice to know that we can address you whenever it's necessary, and so that we will have this common effort to do everything together. I would like to thank also our audience that under these stressful conditions, you have time for learning.
Знають, що таке війна, і саме цей досвід теж є дуже унікальним і важливим. Ми відкриті, з іншого боку, дуже вдячні за ту вашу відкритість.
This experience is really essential. We are open, and thank you for your insights. Thank you for being with us. Thank you.
Thank you. Great to meet you all.
Thank you, Andres. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.